nice long sticks so they can poke each other from a distance. And then the technology to create socketed items comes with spears first, so they'd go on to the end of a stick much better. But it's one of those technologies that is actually quite hard for modern bronze casters to replicate it without thinking about what they're doing. And it's quite interesting. You see, dare I say, the competition quite often make some really basic mistakes because they don't fully understand how the original Bronze Age stuff was made. And I find that quite amusing.
On the question of how things are made, there's a geographical variation, right? In some instances, what's the difference depending on where you are in the UK or even beyond? This was back to the swords.
Well, I think if you head off in a journey heading east, you'll find that going across Europe, swords get more and more ornate. Up into the Nordic countries, there's a lot of bronze handles with decoration engraved or impressed on the handles. And the same if you go all the way across to Eastern Europe. The development of swords is absolutely exquisite with beautiful spirals on the handles and quite amazing. And then by the time you get down to sort of Mycenaean Greece, the swords are absolutely staggering. You get some of the daggers from Mycenae that have gold pictures, gold, silver and copper pictures of people hunting lions. And the scientists are still struggling to figure out how these people could do this nearly 4,000 years ago, put these beautiful images in thin gold sheet and copper sheet onto the surface of bronze daggers. The artistry is something that scientists are struggling to figure out, which I find quite amusing.
Our guest is Neil Burridge. We are talking about his extraordinary hobby, which doesn't seem sufficient a word. He's cast something like 400 sword blades. He's a Bronze Age swordsmith. You're listening to 9 to Noon on RNZ National. One of your first clients, a druid. What's the story there, please? And was this all part of you seeing that you had a market for your talent?
Yeah, I always kind of embrace sort of unusual ideas. And there was Iron Age Centre I was working at, and one of the chaps was dressed up as a druid during this festival, and he said, "Can you make me a sword?" And I'd never made a sword before, and I thought, I'll give it a go. Made one, and I suddenly realised the kudos in it was amazing. Everybody was like, "Oh, wow, a sword. Never seen a sword made of bronze." And that's really what started me off, just by saying yes and having a go. It kind of got the ball rolling, really. But I still get contacted by druids and people on this, I call them on the spiritual level. I had a gentleman come out all the way over from Sweden to collect his sword, which I made a copy of a sword found in Sweden. It was cast into the sea. It was an enormous sword, and it weighed something staggering, like 2.5 kilos, and it was an offering to the gods. It was too big for people to use as a sword. So the sword was cast from a boat into the bottom of a fjord, and it was found sort of 3,000 years later, still stuck in the bottom of the fjord. And the museum employed me to make a copy, and then this young chap saw it at the museum and then came all the way over to England to collect his sword. And it was probably one of the most exciting customer interactions I've ever done in the Witchcraft Museum in Cornwall. He collected the sword there, and I got him to do the final part of attaching the handle slide on, and there was a tiny little rivet running up the middle of the sword called a rat's tail, and he would just hammer the rivet over and closed his own sword with all his sort of fellow followers.
It's a lovely
amazing.
reach back through time, isn't it? And the mudlarkers, of course, we've talked about previously on 9 to Noon, and we will again. Just this joy, as you say, of being out in the riverbeds or whatever, and out in the mud, literally, or gravel from the Thames, and finding, like, reaching your hand through and touching something that was last, available hundreds or thousands of years ago. And there's one delightful story to finish. This was excavations before a house building, I think, at Belfield in the Black Isle village. What was found there? Quite extraordinary find. I can remind you. It's
yeah, you're going to have to.
I'll remind you. It's included what was believed to be one of the first ever moulds for a sickle.
Oh, crumbs! I know where that is. That's North Keswick. Yes, they when they were building a housing estate, they dug up a mould, and fortunately there was a sickle found sort of not far away, which provided a good kind of vision of what it would have looked like.
Extraordinary.
So, yeah. So I would add that the biggest collection of swords in London Museum of London is about 80-something swords, and they were all found in the River Thames by Victorian gravel diggers in the 1800s.
Final question for a guest. What vessel the Bronze Age people used to melt the bronze, and where did they get it? Asks Julian.
Well, you've got plenty of deforestation at the time and plenty of charcoal lying around. So every time you light your barbecue, you're just sort of doing what Bronze Age men did, like they barbecue and melt some bronze.
Thank you, Neil. So lovely to talk. Thanks for your time. Neil Burridge. More information on what he does and his YouTube videos on our webpage, rnz.co.nz/9 to noon. Grant, Nicola has headlines, yeah?
Thanks, Catherine. The government's closing a firearms law loophole in an effort to crack down on gang violence. It will make it an offence to discharge a gun with the intent to intimidate in any public place. It's currently only an offence if a firearm is discharged inside a dwelling. Ram raiders have hit a Wellington liquor store targeting its gin stocks, and a cruise ship with more than 100 positive COVID cases on board has docked in Sydney this morning. Those are the headlines. News coming up again at 11.
Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Today on The Detail, the surprise new deal that will make life easier for Kiwis living in Australia.
If you're a New Zealander, you've been in Australia for 5 years, it becomes more of a right rather than an application.
The Detail on Apple, Spotify, RNZ or wherever you get your podcasts.
27 minutes to 11 on 9 to noon with Catherine Ryan. It's a pretty special day for science. It really is. This is the first images coming through from the James Webb Space Telescope, releasing its first images. This ushers in a new era of astronomy. It's the most powerful and complex telescope ever made, and will allow physicists and astronomers to peer further into the universe's past than ever before. Richard Easter is a professor of physics at the University of Auckland. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
I was going to say there'd be a champagne breakfast, but you want to be very sober to be getting the first information coming out. Tell me what you're seeing that's exciting you.
There's so much here. I'm a person who thinks about how galaxies, are born and evolve, and so the deep images are fascinating to me. But then at the same time, we've got images of clouds of gas and dust in our own galaxy, the Carina Nebula. That's the birthplace of stars. And the James Webb Space Telescope can peer into that, or can see into the gas and dust much further than anything else can. So, we've got kind of a close up of the birth of stars and the birth of the universe. It's a big day.
Can you explain what it is you were able to see visually? People will be seeing their own images, but can you kind of decode what they are going to be seeing, whether it's on the internet or on TV?
If you look at the one of the galaxies, so the deep space one, it's a picture of a cluster, and then it's got a whole bunch of little galaxies behind it. They almost look like kind of hundreds and thousands or something. There are a bunch of tiny little arcs, and those are galaxies that would be roughly spherical, but the light from them has been bent and distorted by the gravity of this big cluster of galaxies in front of them. And you look at that, and that's something that Einstein predicted 100 years ago. It's the observation. It tells us how the first generation of stars in the universe. There was a time when the universe had no stars. The first stars turned on and lit up. They made the first elements beyond hydrogen and helium. All of those things are
Full house. Right, kia ora koutou everybody, good morning. Minister Allan and I have just met with the team that's now heading up Operation Cobalt. It's specifically going to be targeting gangs, and today's measures that we're announcing giving them extra tools to help them to do that. Police have been doing some excellent work so far, both in working with communities and in reducing the number of guns on our streets. Through Operation Tauwhero, over 1,800 firearms have been seized, nearly 1,500 arrests have been made, and 10,000 grams of methamphetamine have been removed from circulation. But as a government, we are keen to make sure that we can do more, and that involves making sure the police have the right tools to be able to do that. We've already put funding into the Gang Intelligence Centre, which enables greater collaboration across different government agencies, non-government organisations and the community. We've increased the number of frontline staff working in specific roles that are tackling organised crimes. We're progressing the firearms protection orders through Parliament. We've banned semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles. We've removed 60,000 guns from circulation through the gun buyback scheme. And we are in the process of putting in place the firearms register and improving the guns licensing system. The government's also funded the rollout of the frontline response model across the country to improve the safety of frontline police and communities. But we want to make sure that there are some real practical measures that police can take when tackling the gangs. So here's the things that we are now going to be putting in place. We'll be introducing a new offence in the Crimes Act that could carry a penalty of up to 5 years in prison if a firearm is discharged with the intent to intimidate any person or group of people. We'll be making an amendment to the Search and Surveillance Act to provide police with additional search powers that will help them to target gang members during gang conflict. We'll be introducing a new cash seizure power to allow police to seize cash thought to be over $10,000 when that is found in suspicious circumstances. We'll be adding watches, jewellery, precious metals and stones, motor vehicles and ships to the list of high-value goods that are prohibited for sale using cash over certain amounts, and that'll involve amending the Anti-Money Laundering and Countering Financing of Terrorism Act. And we're expanding the range of offences that could result in the impoundment of cars, motorbikes and other vehicles. This will include dangerous and reckless driving that we've seen during recent gang convoys. We've been working alongside the police, listening to what they know will help them to do a better job, and we've made these changes, or we will be making these changes as a result of those discussions. Basically, we want to hit the gangs and the offenders where it's going to hurt them. So by going after their guns, their cars, their motorbikes, and making it harder for them to launder money. We're also responding to increased incidents of intimidation and violence on our roads and streets and in homes. This will work alongside the intervention work ministers are doing to stop people, particularly young people, from getting into gangs and this kind of criminal offending in the first place. I'll now hand over to Minister Allan and then we'll be happy to take some questions.
Morena koto. It's Dr. Jared Gilbert that said that solutions need to target particular problems, and this has been the approach that we have taken since we have pulled together the suite of reforms. One of the current problems New Zealanders are worried about, and rightly so, it's the spike in gang warfare, as evidenced just here. So we've designed a fit-for-purpose responses that are targeted at quelling the gang warfare by, as my colleagues said, hitting them where it hurts. We're going after guns, vehicles and cash. New Zealanders have the absolute right to feel safe in our homes, and the police need the adequate powers to do their job. The Ministry of Justice have worked closely with the police to design the suite of targeted measures to ensure police have the tools that they need to tackle violent organised criminal behaviour, whilst also ensuring that the measures are evidence-based and uphold the rule of law. The reality is, as we all know, people don't become gang members overnight. There are enough evidence-based reports to show that the contributing factors for joining gangs hinge on socio-economic factors, families, community environments or lack thereof, and a desire for a sense of belonging. Often these are intergenerational issues and they're complex. While today's announcements are about ensuring that the police have the right tools to crack down on gang behaviour that is violent and completely unacceptable, we also are acutely aware that the best tool that we have is prevention. Preventing people joining gangs in the first instance, we know will always be better than a belated cure. We know that early intervention, rehabilitation and reintegration is the most effective route to sustained and long-term harm reduction. We know that programs targeted towards preventing kids and young people from entering the justice system leads to a reduction in gang membership and turning to a life of crime. We're working across the sector to tackle the causes of gang participation, and I'll be looking particularly closely at the youth justice system to see how we can make changes to improve both the lives of at-risk people and public safety in the long term. In addition, my colleagues, the Minister of Police and the Minister of Social Development, are leading work on the drivers of youth offending, with the Associate Minister of Education focusing on improving educational outcomes for risk that are at-risk youth. So this work is in addition to a broad and concerted effort across government targeting law and order measures. Through Budget 22, the government announced a $562 million law and order package, and that included a $94.5 million package, which is all of government cross-agency response to tackling gangs and organised crime. The measures that we're introducing today are intended to be pragmatic. They're intended to be a targeted suite of tools that will enable the police to be able to do their job and, like I said at the outset, uphold the rule of law. We're happy to take any questions.
Is this the government getting tough on crime?
I completely reject the terminology of tough on crime and soft on crime. We're focused on what actually works. So I've been on the road with the Commissioner over the last 2 weeks, visiting police stations up and down the country. I think, rhetoric like tough on crime and soft on crime means absolutely nothing. What we want to know is that we're giving the tools to the police to do things that are going to work to disrupt criminal offending, and that's exactly what we've been doing.
You mentioned hitting the gangs where it hurts, right? Since you took office, well, since just before you took office, the numbers show that gang member rates have more than doubled. So why do this now? Why not make this a priority as soon as you got in? The numbers were trending that way.
Oh, look, there's a variety of things that have been at play there in terms of the growth in gang-related activity. The police haven't been doing nothing during that time. I reject the idea that this is something that we're suddenly doing. There's been a whole program of work. If you look at Operation Tawhero that I just mentioned, 1,800 firearms seized through that operation alone. There has been a lot of activity in that space.
But numbers have spiraled, haven't they?
Oh, look, the growth in gang membership is complex, and that's not something that we're going to turn around immediately overnight. We've got to actually get underneath that and say, why are people joining gangs in the first place? What's the market that gangs are tapping into? And clearly, there's a drug addiction market there that gangs are making a lot of money off. Those are complex problems, and we will absolutely tackle those as well. But in the meantime, we have to deal with the immediate offending that's in front of us, and that's what we're aiming to do.
How long are people on the streets who, frankly, should be dead? People have driven past their houses, they've got kids in there, they've had gunshots fired into their house, and it's narrowly missed some of these people. What do you say to them?
I say that if you look at the package of measures that we've announced today, it is designed to target exactly that kind of activity. So the new firearms-related offence that we're introducing of discharging a firearm in order to intimidate people. At the moment, there is a loophole in the law that's prevented the police from being able to be tougher on that. They will absolutely be able to take more action in those instances.
How long will it take? Can you guarantee that this suite of measures will curb the rise in gang detention?
Police are working incredibly hard, including Operation Cobalt, which we've just been briefed in more detail on, to really crack down on gang-related activity. But that's a complex piece of work. This set of measures that we're announcing today is not the end of the matter. The government is looking at other issues as well, and we'll continue to work our way through that. I expect that there will be further announcements in due course as we identify new practical steps that we can take to really target this illegal activity.
How long will it take for these
why
to
have
change?
you banned gang patches?
Look, ultimately, that's not going to make a huge amount of difference. And the evidence internationally suggests that it tends to displace gang offending and criminal activity, maybe forces it underground, but it doesn't make it go away.
How long will it take?
We'll be aiming for a relatively speedy legislative process. Obviously, it involves a change to the law, so there's a priority now on getting the law changes drafted. I'll be making sure that happens as quickly as possible, and then we will be working with other parties in Parliament to secure support for the legislation so that it can move its way through the legislative process relatively quickly.
Is as quickly as possible enough comfort for the people that are scared?
Well, the government has to follow the law as well, and so we can't simply announce something and declare that it's the law. It does have to go through a legislative process, but we'll be aiming to make that as efficient as we possibly can.
So will these changes make people feel more comfortable in their own homes?
Well, look, my message to people who are concerned about the escalating level of gang activity across the country is so are we. And we are taking measures that are practical, that are going to make a difference, that the police have advised us will make a difference. We'll continue to look for more things that we can do to disrupt gang offending. And where practical measures come to light that we can take, then we'll work our way through those as well.
And if these changes don't see the improvements that you want to see, will you take responsibility?
Well, like I said, this is not just simply a one-off. This is part of an ongoing program of work. This isn't going to suddenly mean that gang-related activity disappears overnight. We have to actually get underneath some of the causes of that. Gangs have captured a market around illegal drugs, for example, that we can do a lot to disrupt, and we are doing a lot to disrupt. And there's been work for many years in that space. So some of the anti-money laundering legislation, for example, is making a difference, but that doesn't happen overnight. So making sure that we're making it as difficult as possible for gangs to operate in that space is important. But I can also tell you, with my other ministerial hats on, that there is a lot more we can do to choke off the supply of new gang recruits as well. If we get young people engaged in constructive activities that doesn't lead them down a path to more serious criminal offending, then we can actually turn some of this around in the medium to longer term as well. And that's what Minister Allan has just outlined. We've got a whole program of work across government in that area. But
yeah, just off the back of Minister Hipkins there, Corrections have a list of over 2,000 young people that are on their known gang associates list. Of those 2,000 gang members, 100% of them had been in contact with police at a younger stage in life. So what Minister Hipkins is saying right here, look, there's not a silver bullet that you can click your fingers and hope that things work right now, but what we can do is take an all-of-government approach. We can look at the prevention, the intervention measures, and there are a suite of those going across the board. But just in response to somebody else, that one of the key things, I think we've probably learnt this from COVID, is that we are always looking at whether the policy settings that we are making are landing. What we don't want to be is a government of rhetoric. We are a government that's focused on outcomes. So these are the raft of reforms that we're introducing today. As Minister Hipkins said, it's not the end of the line. We'll continue to monitor to see that the policy settings are actually working and working for those that need them most.
Again, there's no silver bullet, but when do you want to see?
Well, right now, arguably, you could say that we're seeing results. Right now, we've just sat with Operation Cobalt and a whole team of people that have been pulled together specifically to target organised gang. They're making interventions, they're making disruptions in activities, whether that's acquiring methamphetamine at earlier stages. So again, it's not this is the start and the end today. The start has been ongoing and there are more and more measures, and this is in addition to the suite of reforms that have already been announced.
How did this loophole become apparent?
Look, I don't know the answer to that, but clearly it's a loophole and it's one that we're moving quickly to close.
Well, Marie Driver said this morning that there is no loophole.
Sorry,
A lot of the Marie Driver said this morning that there is no loophole.
Well,
a lot of this can be done within the current settings.
So there are a suite of offences that could be applicable. What we're seeing, though, is a rise in a particular type of crime. Drive-by shootings aren't something that happened in the 80s and 90s like they are happening right now. So what's going on is that if you have a person who's shooting at a house with the intent to intimidate, yes, you can charge them under a summary offences for intimidation. The maximum penalty, 3 months. I don't think New Zealanders would be satisfied with that as a maximum penalty. Yes, we could also charge them for discharging a firearm. You can charge them under the Firearms Act. Maximum penalty, 6 months. I don't think New Zealanders would be satisfied with that as an outcome. The comparable types of offences that we're looking at, the threat to kill, that carries a maximum of 7 years imprisonment. Threat to kill. Where we've gone here is okay. Well, there's currently under the Crimes Act, if I am discharging a firearm in a dwelling house, that carries a maximum penalty of 3 years. If I'm doing drive-by shootings, probably in the middle, that would probably be about sufficient and what we think is comparable across the board. So yes, there are offences that can be pulled on, but whether they're sufficient, we don't consider that they are.
So on the 14
Well, come over here.
On the 14-day searches, how do you qualify who comes under?
So we've got, clearly there's some work in the drafting to make sure that we're defining this appropriately, but it is targeted at gang-related activity. So, patched gang members, clearly yes. In the drafting, we'll be very clear around exactly what the parameters of that are. So there isn't a lot of legislative definition around this area at the moment, so that is one of the things that we'll be doing in the next few weeks as we get this drafted.
And one of the key criteria there is making sure that there's a gang conflict in place. Yeah. I want to draw on the current experiences that we've just had. You've had police officers that have to wait until an offence has been committed, then they can apply for the warrant, and then they can go about and do their activities.
How do you define a gang conflict?
Well, that's exactly what's right now. I mean, this will be part of our process in terms of the definition that we have to go through as part of a policy process. But where you can see known gangs, so we'll need to have known gangs that are engaged in a type of conflict, as we've seen out here with Killer Bees and others. That process there is going to be critical. It can't be just any other kind of behaviour, but it is tagged to that criminal conflict. There needs to be an escalation, and a judicial officer needs to be satisfied that that's the situation that's in place.
How would you like that defined? Do you guys have a preference, certain amount of shootings or something like that?
Well, I think that where you can see that there's a real disturbance to public safety. So it hinges, the third part of that offence that we're looking at is that where there is a real threat to public safety and broader public safety. I think that's got to be the threshold here. We've got ordinary New Zealanders who have the right to feel safe in their homes. They don't right now because of this particular type of activity.
The ultimate protection here is that police will have to convince the person issuing the warrant that there is an escalating tension between gangs that needs to be addressed.
So it needs to be escalating.
Or a heightened degree of tension between gangs. There is gang conflict at play.
What would be insufficient? And we've turned our minds to these types of issues. What would be insufficient is a person that has a patch. That's insufficient. That's not a gang conflict. Yeah. What we need to see is that there is absolute conflict between gang A, gang B, that's creating a situation.
But for example, the Killer Bees and the tribesmen have had conflict which has lasted years. Could these searches be used?
Carte blanche?
Yeah,
no.
In a time where there isn't some sort of shooting going on.
No, so that's the purpose of this warrant, so that you have to be able to convince a judicial officer that there is a current escalation in conflict, that is a threat to the broader public safety, and it meets the threshold that requires these particular types of surveillance powers.
So what is the safeguard that James is talking about, sort of bottom of the cliff? What's the safeguard at the top of the cliff? Is this what you're talking about, reducing people going in there in the first place, joining gangs in the first place?
Yeah, look, we've got more work happening in that space, which we're not obviously announcing today. Yeah. But the work at the top of the cliff clearly is around drug harm minimisation. It's around making sure that we're reducing the number of young people who are falling into the pathway that's leading them to join gangs in the first place, and a variety of other, some of the community resilience work that we're doing so that communities are more resilient to gang-related activity. Let's be really clear here. I don't just want to drive the gangs underground and then say that's the problem solved. We want to drive their criminal activity out of the community completely. What we've seen from the National Party, for example, a statement saying that if people can't see gang offenders offending that it doesn't matter. Actually, it matters, regardless of whether you can see it or not. We want to drive that criminal offending out of the community.
So you've been touring around the police districts, right? Can you name a couple of programs that you've seen that have been making a difference?
Look, I mean,
specifically, let's name a couple here.
Well, Operation Tawhito in terms of gangs
so
has.
Not police operations, sort of community-based.
If we're talking about preventing young people falling into gangs, for example, there are a whole lot of programs that we funded through COVID-19 through a thing called the Archaeological Fund, which was administered by the Ministry of Youth Development, which was around giving young people positive things to engage in, and it was particularly targeted at those more vulnerable young people in the community. In my own area, the Billy Graham Boxing Academy, for example, had outstanding outcomes where they got young people who were otherwise getting into trouble. They gave them something constructive to engage with. Those kids are more regularly attending school. They're doing better in school. They're not getting into trouble. That's just one example, but there are countless others. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model. Many of these solutions are going to come from within the community. And so our job as government is to say, okay, how can we better support those community initiatives, wherever they're emerging, to make sure that we're giving young people something useful to do that's going to keep them out of trouble.
What is the threshold going to be for the high-value items prohibited for cash sale?
We've got to finalise that. We've just been in conversation. We've just had a conversation about that at the moment. So we'll finalise that in the drafting process.
And does the new law about stopping intimidatory gun shots cover broad people firing in the air to ward off rustlers and equipment thieves?
Yeah, so the issue here is where there is the intention to intimidate. So the threshold applies. These aren't these are carte blanche offences. That's what the Bill of Rights requires. So if you are going out with the intent to intimidate any person with a gun and discharging it at them, it'll be at the discretion to the police as to how they'll charge you there.
Why are gangs so involved right now? Why are gangs so involved right now?
Look, we've seen an escalation in gang-related activity, particularly associated with the importation of a pattern of criminal offending that we haven't seen associated with gangs in New Zealand to the extent that we are seeing now. 501s being deported from Australia is one of the contributing factors. Clearly, we've got more work that we need to do in this area, and that's exactly what we're doing.
And different types of recruitment techniques, I think, as well, has been really enticing, and it does come off the back of what Minister Hipkins was just saying there. There's a new way of recruiting young people. I'm thinking about my patch in the East Coast. It used to be quite you could think back to Once Warriors, and that was the kind of introduction to gang life for many people. It's not quite the same across the board now. It's much more of a enticing lifestyle with bikes and bling and etc. So you'll see that some of these targeted measures that we're introducing are really targeted towards some of the newer measures that are enabling people to enter into those life pathways.
Did the police raise this loophole?
Yes, it was one of the issues that has come out of discussions over the last little while. And like I said, this type of drive-by shooting hasn't been a significant issue for policing in the same way that it has really magnified itself over the last few months. So, look, I think our job as lawmakers is always to look to those that are on the front lines. Have you got the adequate tools? They've told us that this would be a useful provision and a useful fix, and we agree it's evidence-based and it will have an impact for them.
When did it come across, either of your desks?
Well, we've both only been in the job for a couple of weeks now, so I couldn't give you.
Was this raised with Minister Williams?
Look, I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that. I haven't read every briefing that she ever received as the minister, but I think Minister Allan has just made the point that we're seeing an escalation of this type of activity that we haven't seen before, and that has clearly brought this loophole to light. Now we're going to have to get planes shortly, so we'll do a couple more questions. Yeah.
Have you canvassed any other parties to see whether they will support these changes? Do you anticipate they will?
Not yet, but I'm very optimistic.
Actually, I had a discussion with Chris Bishop this morning, and he seemed to be quite persuaded by some of the pragmatism associated with the, particularly the, what provision was it? Oh, the intent to intimidate for discharging a firearm.
Are there any conversations? 2021 to the Arms Act legislation, a year we are still seeing a rise in shooting. Is the legislation even working?
Oh, I think let's be clear about the firearms-related legislation that we've passed over the last 4 years. this is not going to be an overnight process. So we've got a lot of guns off the street. That doesn't mean that we're there yet. Some of that legislation hasn't even been implemented yet. The firearms register, for example, is going to play a really critical role in getting firearms out of the hands of gang members. Last data that I saw suggests that there is only one member on the gang register who has a firearms licence. So they are getting their firearms elsewhere. They're either stealing them or they're getting them from licensed firearm owners who are buying them and then selling them to the gang members. The register will put a stop to that. It will mean that we will be able to track and trace the firearms. That's going to make a difference. That hasn't been fully implemented yet. So, this is a really big program of work that's really sort of hitting its stride now.
How politically damaging are gangs, and how important is it that the public stop talking about them?
Oh, look, I'm not interested in the politics, frankly. I'm not interested in the solution. Gang-related activity is a problem for our community. And as I've said before, I don't just want people to stop talking about it, or I don't want to force it underground. I want to deal with the problem. We want to make sure that we're driving the criminal offending that's being done by gangs out of our communities altogether.
So what's the measure of success? Is it gang numbers?
It's the offending. We're going after the offending, but it's a complex problem. We've also got to look at the drugs as well, because gang members selling drugs to people is causing enormous harm in our community. So we have to go after that as well.
Why did the government let it get so bad before making this?
Look, I disagree with that, with the sort of overall premise of that assertion. The police have been working alongside the government, alongside other agencies, to tackle gang-related activity over the last 5 years that we have been in government. And we haven't done nothing during that time. We've done a lot of things during that time. There's always going to be more work to do.
You mentioned that drugs
last.
A big issue. And at the start, you said that Tofedo had seized 10 kilos worth of cocaine. I've got new data that says that the price of meth has actually decreased over the past 6 months, suggesting that supply has gone up. Do you think police or these kind of more search warrants are really the solve to finding more drugs and getting meth?
Look, there's a lot that we can do in the drug space, and that we will be doing in the drug space. I'm sure that we'll be coming back in due course with more initiatives that we can do there. In terms of the market price for drugs, one of the things that I have discovered on my travels, there is a different price in different parts of the country. New Zealand's prices for illegal drugs are relatively high compared to international standards. But again, Let's target the problem here. I don't just want to make the price go up or down. We actually want to get these drugs out of the community.
Have you had any conversations, final question, any conversations with gang members or with their leaders, just about having that open conversation with them and actually understanding what's going on in their lives?
Look, not in the last few weeks. It'd be fair to say I've had plenty of conversations with gang members in my own electorate and my own community over the time that I have been a member of Parliament. And also have had conversations with people who are working with the gangs to actually target some of the gang activity to provide a pathway out of criminal offending for gang members and gang prospects. And so, I've been able to draw on that experience, but I know Minister Allan has had more conversations in recent weeks.
Yeah, look, I certainly have engaged with people who have expertise in these fields. Like I said, the last thing we want to do is do what they did in the 90s, do what they did in the 2000s, introduce a range of policy reforms that actually didn't tackle the issue. We wanted these to be evidence-based solutions and that would actually work. So yes, have worked alongside those that are experts in these fields that have strong working relationships across the board with police, with others, to make sure that these targeted sweeps would actually have the impact that we desire.
Great. We better go. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
And they're both members of a band called Mountain Man, but they've come together, and this is so sweet. I just love it. I'm going to play it. It's their whole album is out this Friday.